Welcome to Night Stories from VHS Era. You've arrived at a place where the glow of old television screens, the hum of rewinding tapes, and the softness of forgotten childhood dreams come alive once more. Each night will take a quiet journey back in time to sleepy suburbs, moonlit driveways, warm summer breezes, and the kind of memories that feel just a little too magical to be real. Here you don't need to worry. Just press play and let the night unfold. Before we begin tonight's story, let's take a moment to slow down. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath in through your nose. Hold it gently. And now, exhale slowly through your mouth. Let the day melt away with that breath. Again, breathe in deeply. Feel your shoulders soften. Now, release and let go of everything you don't need to carry right now. Imagine you're lying on a cozy bed in your childhood room. Outside, the wind hums softly. The light from a small lamp glows like a warm memory, and the sound of a distant VHS tape spinning fills the air with comfort. You are safe. You are still. And the night is yours. Let's begin tonight's story.
Do you remember the sound of the internet arriving? That strange, garbled screeching that echoed from the phone line like a robot trying to whistle? Did it ever give you chills of excitement as you sat there waiting, hoping it would finally connect? Or maybe you wondered, even back then, why that sound made you feel like something magical was about to happen. Stay with me until the end of this video, and I'll take you back through memories through time so you can remember what that moment meant, and why even now, I sometimes find myself missing a sound most people would consider noise. By the end of this chapter, you'll know what that sound really meant to a whole generation, and maybe you'll understand why we still long for something that was slow, imperfect, and absolutely unforgettable. Let me take you back to a quiet evening in 1996. It was early fall. I remember because the air had that crisp, almost sweet scent that came only once the sun started setting a little earlier, and the leaves outside began whispering instead of rustling. Our house was quiet after dinner. Dad was finishing the dishes, Mom was folding the laundry, and I was upstairs in my room, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, my fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the keyboard of our compact Presario. Room was dim, except for the soft glow of the desk lamp and the monitor, one of those heavy beige boxes with a screen that buzzed softly when it warmed up. I remember how it took a full minute just to come to life. There was a piece to that slowness, a rhythm. And when I clicked a little icon that said America Online, the familiar series of steps would begin. First, the dialing, then the waiting, and then the sound. Do you remember it? It's that first high-pitched screech, like some distant spaceship calling out. Then the rising whine, the digital chattering, static and Morse code blended into something that didn't make sense. Yet you knew exactly what it was saying. It was saying, "You're almost there." It was saying, "Hold on." And when the noise finally fell into silence, and you heard that gentle, almost reluctant welcome, you felt it in your chest like the doors of the world had just opened for you. Why? Did that sound feel so magical? Maybe because it was a promise that something amazing was about to happen? That you were about to step into a place where time moved differently? A place where friends you'd never met waited in chat rooms? Where you could spend an hour downloading a blurry picture and still feel like you'd won something? The world was still small in some ways, but for the first time, it didn't feel that way. And yet, we couldn't use the phone while we were online. That was part of the deal. One or the other. The internet or the outside world. Not both. So, before I clicked connect, I always had to shout down the stairs, "Mom, I'm going online." And sometimes she'd shout back, "Just 10 minutes, I'm expecting a call." That was the dance we did. It was part of the ritual too. I think it made the moment feel even more special because you had to wait for it. You had to ask permission, had to earn it. How long did we wait for pages to load back then? Minutes. Sometimes entire minutes. Watching a line slowly crawl across the screen while an image built itself from top to bottom, like it was growing pixel by pixel, and we watched it, fascinated, as if it were a flower blooming in fast motion. It didn't matter that it was just a picture of a movie poster or a photo of someone's dog. It felt like magic. I remember the first time I visited a website for my favorite cartoon. It was for Animaniacs, and the homepage had this bouncing gif of Yakko waving, and I stared at it for so long I didn't even realize how long it had taken to appear. It was alive. The screen was alive. And through the cables and modems and telephone lines, it had traveled all the way to me. Have you ever felt wonder like that again? It's that feeling of stepping into a place no one else you knew had visited yet? Of discovering something alone and then running to school the next day to tell your friends. Not just what you saw, but how you got there, the patience it took, the sounds it made, the process. I think that's what I miss the most. The slowness, the anticipation, the quiet moments in between the loading and the arriving. Back then, the internet didn't just appear, it arrived. And the sound was always the first sign, the overture to the symphony of the unknown. I can still hear it in my head sometimes. That whine, that digital scramble, that sudden silence when connection was made. It felt like catching a falling star. Like you'd done something important just by sitting there and waiting. Now everything is fast, always connected, always there. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I turn off all the lights, I close my eyes and pretend for a moment that I'm waiting again. That the world is still on the other side of a sound. That I'm still that kid with wide eyes, sitting in the dark, listening to the internet arrive. Because that sound meant more than just a connection. It meant freedom. It meant discovery. It meant that for a little while, you could go anywhere without ever leaving your room. And even now, all these years later, I find myself missing it. Would you believe me if I told you that sometimes I still long to hear it again? Clunky whine, the grinding screech, the pause. Not for what it did, but for what it represented. So, if you've ever sat in front of an old CRT monitor, fingers hovering, waiting, heart pounding a little faster as the modem began its song, you remember, and if you've never heard it, well, maybe now you understand why those of us who did still carry that sound in our hearts. It was noise, yes, but to us, it was the beginning of everything. Sometimes the sound alone wasn't enough. It might sing out the familiar screech and whir, the rise and fall of hopeful tones, and yet silence. Not the good kind, not the satisfying hush that meant you'd made it, but that hollow kind. Uncertain pause. No welcome. No smiley face in the AOL window, just the flat disappointment of a failed connection and the equally familiar message in that dull dialog box. No dial tone detected. Please check your modem and try again. And so we tried again. I think that was one of the things that taught us patience in those days. Real patience. The kind that couldn't be fast-forwarded or skipped or avoided. You had to go through it, click by click, minute by minute. You tried connecting again, then again. And if it still didn't work, you sighed, leaned back in your creaky swivel chair and went downstairs to fix a peanut butter and jelly sandwich while your computer sat there thinking about what it had done. Why didn't it always work? Why did it sometimes take 5, 6, even 10 tries before it finally made it through? Part of it was the line itself. Nights the phone cable had been jostled just enough behind the desk and it wasn't quite secure. Other times, the line was just busy. Maybe someone else on the block was using it. Maybe the stars weren't aligned. Or maybe the internet just didn't feel like letting you in that night. That uncertainty, it made every successful connection feel like a small miracle. I remember standing next to the desk, arms crossed, staring at the computer screen with narrowed eyes like I could somehow will it to work. I'd whisper under my breath, come on, like it could hear me. And when it didn't, when it would let out a squeal and then abruptly cut off, I'd groan dramatically, flop onto the carpet, and start talking to the ceiling. Do you remember what it felt like when it failed again and again? Did you ever talk to your computer as if it were alive? As if it could hear you? I think we all did, in our own way. Sometimes I would even whisper prayers, quiet little wishes. Just let it work this time. Please, as if heaven was somehow tangled in the same. Phone line. I don't know if it ever helped, but it felt like it mattered. Like if you hoped hard enough, you'd get through. The funny part is, the failure became part of the ritual too. It wasn't frustrating in the way things are now. Today, if something doesn't load in 5 seconds, we refresh. We grumble. Complain, but back then, we knew it was part of the deal. We didn't expect perfection. We expected the dance. We accepted the unpredictability. And when it finally did connect, after so many failed tries, the victory was so sweet. I remember one night, it was a Friday, and I had just gotten home from school. I was so excited to log on and check my email, not that I had much in my inbox. Usually just chain letters, a joke from a friend, maybe an e-card someone had sent. But it didn't matter, it was still mine, my little space on the web. I clicked the connect icon and waited. The dial-up tones sang their robotic lullaby, but nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. I went downstairs, checked the phone. It was working. I went back up. Tried again and again. 5 times 10, I started pacing. Started whispering those. Quiet, please. Just let me in tonight. And then, finally, on the 11th try, the tones connected all the way through. I heard that wonderful silence again, and then the voice. Welcome. I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for days. That sound had always made me smile. It was like the internet itself had reached out and said, "Okay, you're in. Come on in." Why did we keep trying over and over? Why didn't we just give up after the first fail? Because what waited on the other side was worth it. It wasn't just about email or chat rooms. It was the feeling of being part of something bigger, of tapping into a world that stretched beyond the walls of our homes. We could hear voices from other states. We could read stories written by people we'd never meet. We could see pictures of places we might never visit. And all of that was worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth praying for even. Do you? Remember that particular mix of frustration and hope? I do. Sometimes I would go down to the kitchen, make some popcorn, pour a glass of orange soda, and just wait 10 minutes. Give it time, let the internet rest. And then I'd go back up, wipe the crumbs from my hands, and try again. And often, more often than not, it would work. What made it feel so special? I think it was the way we earned it. Every successful login felt like we'd unlocked something secret. Like we'd solved a puzzle no one else could. Like the universe had finally said, "Okay, kid, tonight's your night." And even when it didn't work, even when the connection just refused, we didn't throw anything. We didn't scream. We didn't slam the keyboard. We just sighed, turned off the monitor, tried again later. That kind of patience is rare now. There was a quiet strength in those moments. A softness. The kind you only feel when you're doing something slowly, something that requires your full attention and your willingness to wait. And that slowness is what made it beautiful. So the next time you hear someone complain, about a 5-second loading time, close your eyes, take a breath, and remember what it felt like to click connect, to hear those sounds, to hope, to truly hope that it would work, because sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, well, maybe it just meant it was time for a sandwich. Tea was always just a matter of time. I could be online for 5 minutes or 20, halfway through reading a story on a forum, composing an email that I'd already rewritten twice, or downloading a picture that was still crawling across the screen. Pixel by pixel when it happened, the inevitable shout from the hallway. Get off the internet. I need to use the phone. It didn't matter how quietly I had snuck upstairs, how careful I'd been to connect without anyone noticing. Somehow, they always found out. Maybe it was the telltale sound of the modem echoing down the hallway. Maybe it was just timing. But every single time, the spell would break. The magic of the moment would be shattered by that one undeniable fact. Of life back then, the internet and the phone could not coexist. I remember trying to ignore the first call, pretending I didn't hear, hoping they'd forget or give up. But it never worked. The second shout would come louder, more impatient. Seriously, get off. I'm expecting a call. Or sometimes it wasn't even yelling. It was just the sound of the phone picked up downstairs, that loud click, and then the immediate severing of everything I just worked for. Disconnected, gone. It was one of those constant household negotiations. Who got the phone line and when? Sometimes there were scheduled blocks. You go online after dinner, but only until 8. Sometimes it was first come, first served. Sometimes it was chaos. It's just voices clashing, footsteps stomping. The unspoken tension that lived in every house with only one line. I knew the internet was a guest. The phone had seniority. It had been there longer. It had more authority. And most importantly, adults used it. They needed it for work, for calls, for real things. Not like me, holed up in my room, trying to download MP3s or read strangers' blog posts from Kansas. And yet, it never felt fair. The moment I got kicked off, I'd sit on the floor and stare at the disconnected screen like it had betrayed me. Like it should have tried harder to hold the line. And for a while, I'd sulk, pretend to be okay. But inside, I was seething with that quiet teenage rage. The kind that never got shouted. Just absorbed, bottled up, stored. I remember one afternoon, I was finally in a Yahoo chat room talking to someone who claimed they were from Finland. We were having a real conversation, not about anything serious. It was school and music and whether the Matrix had already come out there. I was typing as fast as I could, trying to keep the flow going, when my little sister knocked on the door. Mom says, "Get off the internet. Grandma's calling." I ignored her. She knocked again. I said, "Get off. It's important." Kept typing. I didn't want to lose the rhythm, the thread of the conversation. But just as I hit enter, I heard the unmistakable sound of the phone picking up. Then the garbled screech. Then the line dropped, disconnected. I sat there in silence, staring. At the connection lost box as it blinked on my screen, I didn't even get to say goodbye. That person from Finland probably thought I'd just vanished, or ghosted them, and never find them again. There was no user history, no saved. Messages, no backup. Once it was gone, it was gone. That was the risk. That was always the risk. Some families tried to solve it with a second line, if they could afford it. I remember the first time I heard someone say they had a separate line just for the internet. And I looked at them like they were royalty. I couldn't even imagine such freedom. Being able to connect whenever you wanted, without waiting, without asking, without being told to disconnect. But for most of us, it was a shared experience. A battle for the line. The phone was the lifeline of the home. The internet was still a novelty, a luxury, a fragile dream that lived only in the moments. When no one else needed to talk, the tension of those years lived not in loud fights, but in small sighs. In looks exchanged across the dinner table. In the question always loaded, "Are you using the phone?" That didn't mean the telephone. That meant the modem. That meant the web. That meant I need it more than you do. So many half-finished messages. So many conversations cut off at the peak. So many downloads halted at 78%, never to resume. And always the reason was the same. Someone needed to make a call. It's strange now, just thinking about how much power the phone once had. One line running through the house like a lifeline, determining who got to talk, who got to type, and who got to wait. I think we learned a kind of diplomacy because of it. We learned how to bargain, how to plead, how to offer to make dinner, or take out the trash just for 10 extra minutes online. We learned how to live with interruptions, with unexpected endings. With the delicate balance of wanting something deeply, but knowing someone else needed it. Too, it was humbling, frustrating, and weirdly beautiful. There was one night I remember. It clearly had just started a download. It was a picture, probably a band I liked. It was only 150 kilobytes, but that meant at least 2 minutes, probably more. I was watching it load line by line when my dad knocked softly. "Hey, can you get off? I need to call your aunt." I looked at the screen. The image was just halfway done, I looked back at him. He looked tired. The kind of tired that didn't argue. "Yeah," I said. "Just give me 10 seconds." And I watched the bar move. Slowly. Agonizingly. And then, just as the final line of pixels settled in, I clicked disconnect. The modem word one last time. The internet slipped away and I stood up and went downstairs, thinking I got what I came for. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes think about that moment. The trade-offs, the negotiations. The way we all had to learn how to share something. Invisible and precious. It taught me something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. Patience, yes, but also compromise. And the understanding that sometimes letting go was the right thing to do, even when it meant saying goodbye to Finland. There was a kind of magic in watching an image load line by line. Not just magic suspense, a ritual. A game of patience that most people today wouldn't even recognize. You'd click a link or open an email, and suddenly the screen would begin to shift. Single gray bar, then a blur of pixels, then another bar, revealing just enough to keep you guessing. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't clear, but it was thrilling in its own quiet way, like standing in front of a painting that was still being created one stroke at a time. Sometimes I'd lean forward, elbows on the desk, eyes locked on the screen as if staring would make it move faster. Other times I'd step away for a minute, refill a glass of water, or check the hallway to make sure no one was about to pick up the phone and ruin everything. But more often than not, I just waited, watching, hoping. Each new line of pixels felt like a reward. Like the image itself was teasing me, challenging me to stay, to care, to endure the slowness for the sake of the reveal. It didn't matter. If it was a picture of a band, a poster from a movie, or just a funny meme I didn't yet understand. What mattered was the process, the anticipation, the idea that something was being built, and I was there to witness it from the first pixel. To the last, sometimes the image would glitch. A random streak of green across a face, a corrupted corner, a block of static that refused to resolve. That was the risk of the dial-up world. Nothing was guaranteed. A full image was a prize, a complete story, a tiny victory earned through patience. And luck, there were days I would sit and watch a picture load for 10 minutes straight, barely blinking. I knew better than to refresh. Refreshing could mean starting from scratch, if the internet dropped mid-download, which it often did. I had to hope that the browser had cached just enough of the image, so that when I reconnected, I wouldn't have to relive those minutes again. JPEGs were the most common. They loaded top to bottom in perfect little bands. Sometimes you could guess what the image was just from the first quarter sky hair, background color. Other times, you'd have to wait nearly to the end to understand what you were really looking at. It was slow, but there was art in that slowness, an intimacy in how it revealed itself, as if the computer was whispering, "Just wait, almost there. You'll see." I remember one time I found a picture of a beach in Italy. I had typed Amalfi Coast into a search engine just because I liked the sound of it. One of the image links looked promising. I clicked, and then I waited. The blue sky appeared first, strip of ocean, then cliffs, row of colorful buildings. I had never been to Italy, but for the few minutes it took to load that image, I felt like I was traveling. Like the screen was a window to another world. I'd saved the picture, looked at it every day for a week, dreamed of going there one day. And then there were the images that were more than travel or art. The ones that felt like secrets. Scans of magazine pages, photos from concerts, pictures your friend told you about at school that you had to see for yourself. Back then, a single image could be the currency of cool. If you found one that no one else had, you were ahead of the curve. In the know, I used to print them out. 2, slowly, painfully, on the noisy inkjet printer that always ran out of color at the worst time. I'd tape the pictures to my wall, my binder sometimes fold them into my notebooks. That was how we built. Identity. One image at a time. One slow download after another. But not every picture was worth the wait. Some would load halfway, then stall. Others would reveal themselves only to be disappointing. And yet even the bad ones had value because they were earned, because you had spent time for them. You had clicked, you had waited, you had committed. That was what made it feel different from today. Now you scroll, you tap, you see everything at once. Thousands of images every hour if you want. But back then, every picture was a decision, a moment of curiosity, leap of faith. And because it was slower, you saw more. You noticed the background, the composition, the tiny details that now get lost in the blur of constant swiping. You'd stare at one picture for minutes, not because you had to, but because that was the pace, that was the rhythm. And somehow that rhythm stayed with you. I think it made me more patient, not just with the internet, but with life. It taught me that some things take time to reveal themselves, that beauty can come slowly, that clarity isn't always instant. There was a specific night I remember vividly. It was late, almost midnight, and the house was quiet. I had found a picture from a new album release a band I loved. The image was moody, black and white, full of shadow. Clicked to enlarge it, and the page began to load. First the top of a head, then a forehead, then eyes. I didn't breathe. I was afraid to move. As the image continued, I could see the edge of a guitar, a hand, a faint smile. Every line that appeared was like a heartbeat. The room was dark, except for the light of the monitor. I felt like I was in a theater, watching a performance designed just for me. And when the last line loaded, when the image was wholly smiled. Not because the picture was perfect, but because I had seen it arrive. I had been there for every second of its becoming. That's something we've lost a little, I think. The joy of waiting, the slow build. The reward of staying still long enough to let something unfold. Those moments taught me that even digital things could have weight, could have presence, could stay with you. Because it wasn't just about watching images load. It was about discovering what they meant, one line at a time. There was a time when just opening the internet felt like cracking open a secret portal. And that portal almost always had one of two names: Netscape Navigator or Internet Explorer. These weren't just browsers, they were gateways. They were the vessels through which I experienced a world that was still mostly a rumor, a place I had only heard about in fragments from tech magazines, school hallways, and whispered instructions from kids who had tried going online once or twice. Netscape had this deep blue interface, almost comforting in its seriousness, like it knew it was letting you into something important. Internet Explorer, on the other hand, felt more like the default setting of life, a white page with a little blue E in the corner, staring back like a polite clerk at a library counter. You could use either to get to roughly the same places. But choosing one over the other felt like picking a personality. Netscape users seemed a little more adventurous, Explorer users more practical. I, like many, switched between both, depending on mood, luck, or which one wasn't crashing that day. Back then, websites were quieter. Pages took time to load, but even once they did, they didn't shout at you. There weren't 100 pop-ups trying to sell you things. The backgrounds were plain. The text was honest. A simple banner across the top, some hyperlinks, visitor counter at the bottom. And that made every click feel like a step deeper into something meaningful. I remember the first time I typed something into the address bar. It was awkward, like learning to drive for the first time. Every keystroke felt heavy. I typed www. Slowly, cautiously, then the rest. Then hit enter and waited. The browser blinked. A soft grinding came from the modem. Then, like magic, a page appeared. Not immediately, never immediately, line by line, like a curtain rising on a digital stage. There was something about the act of typing a full URL. You had to know it, you had to trust it. Bookmarking was a luxury. Autocomplete didn't really exist. So every website you visited was a conscious choice, an effort, a commitment. There was no algorithm feeding you what it thought you wanted. You had to want it first. You had to go looking. Sometimes you didn't even know what to look for, so you clicked around. You followed links like breadcrumbs, each one taking you further from what you knew and closer to what you didn't. I would land on pages filled with articles, fan theories, weird poetry, and clunky forums. Nothing looked polished, but everything felt alive. Netscape Navigator had this little animation of a ship steering through a starfield when it loaded a page. It was subtle, but it meant everything. You weren't just browsing, you were voyaging. You were moving forward into the unknown. Internet Explorer had its own spinning globe, or a bluey, a bit more corporate, but still mesmerizing in its motion. It meant something was happening. You were connected. The experience was limited, sure. JavaScript barely worked, as Flash was. Unstable. Videos took forever. But none of that mattered, because even static text and tiny images were miracles. There was so much trust in the process, so much wonder. You weren't multitasking. You weren't streaming or chatting or doom scrolling. You were there, completely present, following the story of a page, seeing where it led. One of my favorite things to do was explore personal websites. People would build entire homepages about themselves. Sometimes the design was chaotic, bright. Backgrounds, blinking text, embedded MIDI music. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was real. Someone had written those words, uploaded those pictures, shared pieces of their life, their fandom, their thoughts. Each site was like a room in someone's house you had been invited into, and you were polite. You read what they wrote. Maybe even signed the gut. Explorer had this tendency to crash if you opened too many tabs, which was funny because tabs weren't really a thing yet. If you wanted a second page, you opened a new window. Your screen could be cluttered with 10 windows at once, each one fighting for bandwidth and attention. And when one crashed, sometimes they all crashed. A blue screen, a frozen mouse, a soft sigh of frustration. But that was part of it too. The fragility, unpredictability. The idea that the internet wasn't stable, but it was trying. So were you. I remember searching for song lyrics once. It took me 20 minutes to find the right website, another 5 to load it, and when it did, it was wrong. The lyrics were slightly off. A misplaced word, a missing verse, but I printed them anyway because it was close enough, because I had worked for it. Because it felt earned, and the browsers themselves were always changing. Updates came out with little fanfare. Sometimes a new version would look exactly the same. Sometimes it would break everything. But we didn't complain. We adapted. We clicked through the error messages. We learned how to fix broken links and clear cache and reset settings without knowing what any of it really meant. Using a browser back then was like navigating a small boat in an enormous fog. Couldn't see the whole landscape, but you trusted. The stars. You trusted your instincts. You clicked and hoped. You read and learned. You came back to the same pages day after day because they felt like home. There were no tabs to organize your thoughts. No incognito mode to hide your mistakes. Everything you did was recorded in plain sight. Your history was a diary. Your bookmarks were sacred. And if someone else used the computer, you could always tell. The homepage would be different. Font changed. A strange sight appeared in the history log. The digital world was small, personal, tangible. Sometimes I miss that. It's not because it was better, modern browsers are faster, smarter, more capable, but because it was slower. And in that slowness, there was room to breathe. Room to wonder, room to feel like every click mattered. Opening Netscape Navigator was an invitation. Launching Internet Explorer was an event. The internet wasn't just a tool, it was a destination. And the browser was your vessel. So even though the pages were simple and the load times brutal, I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. Because every time I sat down, double-clicked that little icon, and watched the screen come to. Life, I felt like something incredible was just around the corner. And more often than not, it was. And there was a distinct thrill that came from logging into AOL. Just hearing the sound of welcome through those tinny computer speakers was enough to spark something. You felt chosen. Like you had just stepped into a universe within your own room. The world outside could be boring, gray, quiet. But inside that login screen, with its spinning yellow man and hopeful connection tones, there was a different kind of magic brewing. And once you were in, once the loading bar disappeared and the homepage appeared in all its cluttered glory, the real adventure began. The heart of it all, the very soul of AOL, was the chat room. Not the homepage headlines or the odd weather updates. Not the keyword searches or the funny sound effects. The chat room. That digital cauldron where total strangers would meet. Type, laugh, vanish, and sometimes reappear again. I remember the very first time I entered one. It was like stepping onto another planet. The interface was basically a long scroll of screen. Names on one side, a message feed in the middle, and a tiny input box below where you could send your thoughts out into the void. But even though it was simple, it felt like standing in the middle of Times Square, neon lights and voices flying in every direction, even though you were really just sitting in a small room under a dim bulb with a bulky CRT monitor humming, softly beside you. Picking your screen name was the first real challenge. It had to say something about you, but not too much. It had to sound cool, but not desperate. Edgy, but not dark. Creative, but not weird. That's how we ended up. Names like Cool Kid 92, Sweet Girl NY, Skater Dude 34, and Techie Queen 77. Mine changed more than once. Sometimes it was a version of my real name with a number tacked on. Other times it was something completely fictional, like I was slipping into a costume before a performance. Cool Kid 92 wasn't necessarily cool, and probably wasn't born in 1992, but in the chat room, none of that mattered. You could say you were from New York or Paris or a tiny town in Alaska. You could say you loved punk rock or classical music. You could talk about your pet iguana or pretend you had one. Because that was the secret to it. All nobody really knew anything for sure. The imagination did the rest. There were rooms for everything. Teen chat, music fans, science geeks, world travelers, bookworms, themed rooms, and random ones. Some nights I would hop from room to room, scanning the participant list like a guest at a chaotic digital party, peeking into conversations, tossing out a quick hi or what's up or a zeal, the holy trinity of online icebreakers. Age, sex, location. That was the ritual. Someone said hi. Someone else replied, 17M, Florida. And just like that, a thread began. Two people halfway across the world would suddenly be engaged in a flurry of messages, revealing just enough about themselves to stay interesting, and withholding just enough to keep the mystery alive. Emojis weren't what they are now. There were no yellow faces or animated reactions, just humble combinations of parentheses, semicolons, and COLONS, meaning happy, sad, flirtatious, or sarcastic, depending on the context. And somehow, those little symbols carried weight. You'd reread a message just to interpret the meaning. Behind a smiley face, was it real? Was it teasing? Did it mean something deeper? The chats were chaotic, text flying across the screen faster than you could read. Someone spamming lyrics, someone else shouting in all caps, another person trying to share a joke that got buried before anyone could react. But in the middle of the storm, every once in a while, you'd find a moment of connection, a message that felt like it was written just for you, an exchange that made you laugh out loud for real, not just type lol. I remember one night in particular. I was in a chat room called Dreamer's Corner. No idea who created it or why, but it had the quiet vibe of a late-night diner. People there weren't yelling or posting links. They were talking, really talking, about music, about life, about dreams they had that week. Someone mentioned they wanted to be a writer. Another talked about moving to the coast to start a new life. Someone confessed they felt invisible at school. And for a second, it was like being at a campfire. Everyone passing around thoughts instead of marshmallows. That night, I made a connection with someone who called themselves Eka River. We talked for over 2 hours. About books, about weird dreams, about nothing really. I said they lived in Oregon, loved thunderstorms, and collected postcards from places they'd never been. I never found out who they really were. We chatted. A few more times after that, then they vanished, like most people did. But I still remember how the screen glowed that night.
Oh.
I typed slower, more thoughtfully. How I felt like someone out there saw me, even if just for a few lines. The beauty of those chat rooms wasn't just in the freedom, it was in the anonymity. You could try out versions of yourself. You could speak without fear. You could listen without judgment. The weird, quiet kid at school could be the witty commentator online. The shy bookworm could become the queen of the conversation. There were no pictures, no filters, just words. And somehow, that was enough. Every time you entered a chat room, it was a new chance, a new stage, a new night. And even though most conversations fizzled out, or ended in awkward goodbyes or abrupt logouts, you always came back, because you never knew what would happen next. Logging off was strange. You'd say G to G or B or just disappear mid-sentence. There was no formal goodbye, no guarantee you'd ever see those usernames again. But there was something poetic about that too. Fleeting moments, digital fireflies blinking across your screen, leaving little impressions that somehow stayed longer than they should have. And even though those chat rooms eventually disappeared, swallowed up by newer platforms, faster apps, and polished networks, I still think about them.
Ups, out, away.
Strangers Connected. It's about the weird screen names and the weird stories, about how a simple line of text could make you feel less alone. Because back then, all it took was a modem, a screen name, and a little imagination. And suddenly, the world didn't feel quite so far away. There was a certain ceremony to downloading music back then. It was never as simple as pressing play. No, it was a pilgrimage of patience, hope, and timing. You had to prepare for it like you were planning a heist. Every step mattered. Every second counted. And in the back of your mind, there was always that whisper of doubt. Would it actually work this time? The process started with choosing the song. Not just any song, but the song. That one track you had been obsessing over since you heard it on the radio, or caught a snippet on a burned CD someone lent you at school. You couldn't just stream it instantly or ask a voice assistant to play it. You had to go out and hunt it down. Sometimes you didn't even know the exact name. It's maybe just a fragment of the chorus or a vague idea of the artist. You'd type what you remembered into the search box, hoping someone had labeled the file correctly. That's when file sharing. Programs entered the picture. Napster, Kazaa, LimeWire, BearShare, each had its quirks and dangers. You learned to look for telltale signs, file sizes that looked suspiciously small, strange usernames offering dozens of versions of the same song, or download times that promised miracles but delivered viruses instead. Still, we braved those waters, all for the thrill of finally having that song on our hard drive. Clicking download was like planting a seed. You'd sit and watch that slow progress bar start to move, pixel by pixel. Estimated time, 57 minutes, and you waited. Oh, how you waited. Sometimes you'd stare at the screen as the kilobytes crept in. Other times you'd try to distract yourself with homework, chores, or flipping through TV channels only to race. Back every 10 minutes to check if it had moved. Sometimes it had, sometimes it hadn't. And then came the worst part, the fear. The constant gnawing anxiety that someone in the house might pick up the phone. Because in that fragile dance of dial-up, internet, and household landlines, only one could survive. You could surf the web, or you could make a call. Not both. And God help you if your sibling or parent forgot. I remember holding my breath every time I heard footsteps near the phone. The sound of someone reaching for the receiver was like the ticking of a time bomb. You wanted to shout, but you didn't dare interrupt the connection, so you sat in silent terror, praying they would remember. Just one more minute. It's just 30 seconds. Please, just let the song finish. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. When the connection dropped mid-download, it was like watching your sandcastle get washed away by a wave. Everything you had waited for, gone in an instant. The file corrupted, the download failed, and worst of all, cursed pop-up, connection lost. You'd sit there, staring at the screen, disheartened. Reconnecting meant dialing back in, hearing that familiar chorus of screeches and static, and hoping the site hadn't gone offline. Sometimes you'd start over. Sometimes you gave up for the night, too emotionally drained to try again. But oh, when it worked, and the stars aligned, the phone stayed untouched, the internet held steady, and the file downloaded successfully. The feeling was indescribable. You'd click on the song, wait for your media player to load Winamp, probably and hold your breath as the music began. It wasn't always the right version. Sometimes it was a live recording or some strange remix, or worse, a fake-out track with someone whispering you just got trolled. But when it was right, when it matched what you had imagined and waited for, it felt like magic. You had conquered the system. You had bent time and technology to your will. That 4-minute track was a badge of honor, proof of your patience and dedication. You'd listen to it over and over again, alone, with headphones on, repeat. You might even make a little playlist with your other prized downloads, carefully labeled, sorted, and backed up on a floppy disk or burned onto a blank CD. There was pride in your collection, however small, because you earned it, as every file had a story. Every song was a victory. The way we consumed music back then had a kind of intimacy that's hard to describe now. There was no shuffle button, no infinite scroll of recommendations, just a few tracks you had waited hours for. You knew every second of them, every little scratch or weird fade-out. You listened carefully, repeatedly, almost religiously, not because you were forced to, but because you wanted to. You had invested time, you had sacrificed connection, you had endured. And in a way, it brought people together. Friends would swap files through USB drives or CDs. We'd gather around computers to play new tracks, each person bringing their hard-earned treasures to the group. Check this one out, someone would say, clicking on a freshly downloaded hit. We'd nod, hum along, ask for a copy. The act of sharing music felt like passing along a secret, a gift only the internet could provide. You were patient enough. There were times when a song took the whole night to download. I'd start it late in the evening, then leave the computer humming quietly. The screen dimmed, praying no one would unplug it or shut it down. I'd go to sleep with that quiet hope in my chest, and in the morning rush to the screen. Download had completed. It felt like Christmas. If it had failed, well, another night would come. Looking back, it seems absurd. Waiting an hour for something you can stream instantly now. Risking viruses, broken connections, and family arguments just to hear one track. But that was the reality. And in that friction, that effort, something beautiful happened. We learned patience, we learned resilience, and we learned that joy sometimes takes time. Now, with music at our fingertips, it's easy to forget what it felt like to earn a song. To sit in the glow of a monitor, watching the minutes tick by, dreaming of the moment that bass line would kick in. It wasn't just about music. It was about determination, about finding ways to connect, to express, to belong. One download at a time. Before everyone had a GPS in their pocket, and long before cars started speaking directions out loud, there was MapQuest. That glorious, frustrating, paper-fueled middle ground between physical maps and digital navigation. If you were going anywhere unfamiliar, the process always began the same way. Sit down at the computer, open the browser, and hope MapQuest loaded quickly enough to print your route before someone needed the phone. It wasn't just a matter of entering an address. You had to think about it. You had to know where you were going and have a rough idea of how to describe it. Sometimes you didn't even have the exact destination address. Just a street name, a landmark, or a vague neighborhood someone had mentioned in a hurried conversation. You'd type in what you knew and squint at the suggested options, trying to guess which one matched your memory. Once the site processed the information and spat out your directions, it was time to print. Usually several pages long, these instructions were dense, mechanical, and occasionally mystifying. Turn slight right onto County Road 18B. Continue for 2.7 miles, then bear left. It sounded precise, but in practice you were just hoping the road signs would agree. Holding those printed pages in your hands felt like carrying a fragile promise. You'd fold them in half or thirds, tuck them into the passenger seat, and glance at them nervously at every red light. If someone else was in the car with you, they became the official navigator. Their job was to shout out each step like a co-pilot. In a rally race. Okay, next we take exit to 1B toward Elmhurst Avenue. That's in about 6 miles. And if you were alone, well, that was a true test of memory and faith. You'd scan over the directions at the start, trying to commit them to heart. Landmarks became lifelines. The page said turn left after. The Shell Station. You were suddenly the Shell Station's biggest fan. But what if it wasn't there? What if construction blocked your path? What if you missed the turn and had to loop back? There was no rerouting, no helpful voice saying recalculating. You were on your own. I remember one road trip in particular. We were heading to a friend's birthday party in another town. It's not far, just about 45 minutes away, but unfamiliar enough to justify a printout. I printed 3 copies just in case. One for me, one for my friend riding shotgun, and a backup in my backpack. We highlighted the major turns and circled questionable intersections. We felt prepared, confident, until we missed the 3rd turn. Just like that, the list of directions became a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. We tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. Every gas station started to blend into the last. The numbers on the odometer didn't line up with the distances we'd been given. We pulled over and reread the same 3 lines, hoping the answer would appear if we stared hard enough. Continue straight for 1.4 miles. Turn right onto Maple. Drive. Which Maple Drive? There were 3. We had already passed 2 of them. Eventually, we stopped at a diner to ask for help. The woman behind the counter didn't even glance at our MapQuest printout. She just pointed and said, "Take a left at the light, then another left at the church. It's behind the big water tower. No mile markers, no decimal precision. It's just human knowledge handed down like a folktale." Somehow, we made it, late but with a story. That was the reality. You hoped the directions were right, but you always knew they might not be. MapQuest was brilliant for its time, but it never accounted for detours, roadwork, or human error. And it definitely didn't update in real time. The bridge was closed, or the exit renamed. Your printout might as well have been a paper airplane, even worse. If the printer ran out of ink halfway through, you'd end up with a page that stopped. Mid-sentence, turn left onto, and then nothing. A mystery rode into the void. Or worse, the final destination address got cut off. I once went to a concert armed with instructions that ended just before the venue's street. We circled for 40 minutes, asking pedestrians if they knew where it was. None did. Eventually, we heard the music from 2 blocks away and followed the sound like lost children chasing a melody. Still, there was something romantic about it. The vulnerability, the effort. The idea that a few sheets of printed text held your entire journey. It made traveling feel adventurous, even dangerous. You were responsible. You had to stay alert. The world didn't reroute for you. It also sparked conversations. You couldn't rely on automation, so you had to talk. Ask for help. Read signs out loud. Argue over whether slight right really meant go straight. Every wrong turn was a lesson. Every missed exit a moment to recalibrate, not just your route, but your entire approach to movement. MapQuest was a mirror of the early internet itself, full of promise, clunky but earnest, and just good enough to be helpful most of the time. It taught us to plan, to print backups, to triple-check everything before hitting the road. And when all else failed, to trust strangers and landmarks over lines of text. Sometimes I miss that feeling. It's that mix of dread and determination. Now, with GPS apps correcting every misstep, it's easy to get complacent. But back then, every journey required focus. You couldn't afford to zone out. The road was alive, full of unknowns. And your printed directions were a fragile map through its chaos. You learned to trust your instincts, to read the landscape, to ask for directions, not just as a last resort, but as a part of the experience. And you learned that getting lost wasn't the end of the world. In fact, sometimes it led to the best stories. The ink-smudged pages, the sighs of frustration, the joy of finally seeing your destination, these things stitched themselves into memory, not just because they were hard, but because they mattered. Because you earned every mile, one printed turn at a time. There was something enchanting about discovering that the internet was not just a tool, but a playground. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was no better example of this than GeoCities. That chaotic, glitter-covered corner of the web was where creativity met freedom. And personal web pages became tiny digital kingdoms for anyone with enough patience, curiosity, and a dial-up connection. I remember the first time I stumbled across a GeoCities site. It wasn't sleek or polished. It didn't follow any design rules because the people who made them weren't designers. They were dreamers, hobbyists, teenagers with stories to tell, collectors with rare obsessions, amateur, poets, fans of anime and aliens and angels and anything in between. And they weren't waiting for permission. They were building worlds out of blinking text, auto-playing MIDI files, rainbow Comic Sans. It was like peeking inside someone's diary. If that diary was written with HTML and filled with sparkly, unicorn GIFs and links that sometimes worked, some pages had guestbooks you could sign, and it felt like leaving your name on a digital wall of history. Others had hit counters that proudly displayed how many visitors had stopped by, even if. That number barely moved from week to week. Each site was personal, raw, often clumsy, and always full of soul. At first, I was just a wanderer, clicking through pages like I was walking through an endless digital neighborhood. GeoCities was organized by cities based on themes. Area 51, for sci-fi fans, Hollywood for entertainment, Heartland for personal journals. Each homepage felt like a living room decorated by its owner. Some had tiled backgrounds that made your eyes hurt. Others played music automatically, often clashing with whatever song was already coming from your Winamp playlist. But then something shifted. I wanted to build my own. Creating a GeoCities page was both thrilling and terrifying. You didn't need to know much code, just enough to paste from templates or copy what others had done. I remember starting with a basic layout, a header, a sidebar, a main section with too many colors. I added a welcome message that blinked. I uploaded a low-resolution picture of my cat, and because everyone else had one, I added a sparkly, horizontal rule GIF that shimmered like digital tinsel. The moment I published it and saw my page live on the web, something changed in me. It was like planting a flag in a new world. I didn't just exist online. Had a space, a home, somewhere to say, this is me. Even if me was just a collection of favorite quotes, random thoughts, and a countdown to my next birthday. I watched as others did the same. Some created fan sites for their favorite TV shows, filled with pixelated screen caps and detailed episode guides. Others built tribute pages for their pets, complete with scrolling marquees and photos in frames. Some wrote diaries, updated daily, or whenever inspiration struck. There were pages with digital clocks, fake email warnings, animated flames, and under construction signs that remained forever in progress. No two pages were alike, but they all shared something rare and precious: intention. No one was doing it for followers, likes, or algorithms. They weren't trying to go viral, or just trying to express themselves, to belong. To build something, I started learning more HTML than I ever expected. Simple things at first: how to center text, how to change fonts, how to link to another page. But over time, I got bolder. I built navigation bars. I added photo galleries. I learned how to embed music, even if it meant forcing every visitor to listen to my chosen theme song. I took pride in each update, like rearranging furniture in a room only a few people would ever visit. And there was always a thrill in updating my guestbook. Every new comment felt like a gift. Cool site, with a smiley face made of colons and parentheses. I'd reply in kind and then probably visit their page, leave a message, and fall into a new rabbit hole of digital personalities and glittery graphics. We didn't worry about privacy the way people do now. Our pages had our names, our cities, sometimes our school schedules, or our favorite pizza toppings. It was innocent in the way early internet spaces could be, before the darker corners grew louder. We were open because we didn't know not to. And then there were the clicks. We brings, banners, online clubs you could join by pasting a badge on your homepage. I joined one for cat lovers, another for future writers of America. There was no vetting process, just email. The webmaster, usually another teenager, got added to the ring. It felt like being part of something bigger, even if that something was a loose circle of people who liked the same obscure anime. Looking back, it's almost impossible to explain how meaningful it was. These weren't social networks in the modern sense. They were not built for scrolling. It required intention. You had to visit. You had to stay. And when you left, it was because you clicked a link that took you somewhere new. Not because an algorithm nudged you forward, Jeocities. Taught us that the web wasn't just information. It was expression, creativity, community. It told us we didn't have to wait for someone else to build a site for us. We could make our own, however messy or magnificent. And when the platform eventually faded, when Yahoo bought it and the pages slowly went dark, it felt like the end of an era. Some of those sites were archived, but many vanished completely. Whole digital identities evaporated. Voices that once echoed in blinking text and looping MIDI files were silenced. The sidewalks of that virtual city crumbled quietly like forgotten dreams. But if you were there, you remember. You remember what it felt like to open Netscape Navigator. Type in your Geocities URL and see your little creation pop up on the screen. Remember refreshing your guest book, tweaking your HTML, adding one more sparkle to the page. You remember the magic not because it was perfect, but because it was yours. And even now, in the age of sleek websites and curated profiles, I carry that feeling with me. The thrill of building, the joy of sharing, the belief that the internet could be more than noise, it could be home. Logging off was always an event, not dramatic, not loud, but quietly significant in a way that still lingers in my memory. It was the sound of the modem winding down, the gentle click of the mouse as I closed my browser, and the faint hum of the computer slowly falling silent. There was no infinite scroll back then. The internet didn't chase you, it waited for you, and when you left, it didn't try to follow. I remember sitting in the glow of the monitor, staring at my Geocities page, or an AOL chat room, a blinking message board filled with threads I never finished reading, and knowing it was time to disconnect, because someone else needed the phone, because it was dinner, because it was bedtime, simply because I had spent hours online and needed to let go. But letting go was never easy. There was always that slight ache as I prepared to exit, that small flicker of sadness in my chest, like walking away from a good book before the last chapter. The internet was a space of wonder and possibility. But it was also finite. There was no cloud to back everything up. If you didn't save your work, it was gone. If the power blinked, so did your session. And if you left, there was no guarantee you'd find the same thread, the same room, the same person when you returned. Every time you logged on felt like stepping into a carnival that might vanish by morning. And so, logging off carried weight. It meant stepping back into the analog world, where time passed slower but more tangibly, where conversations happened, face to face, where curiosity required libraries, bookstores, and long walks to clear your head. There was no instant reply, no feed to refresh, no push notifications to keep you tethered. The online world paused when you left, at least in your corner of it, and the quiet that followed was both peaceful and unsettling. Sometimes, I would sit there a few extra minutes before turning off the screen, just to soak in the digital warmth that remained. My room would be dark, except for the light of the monitor, my hands hovering over the keyboard. One last check of my email. One last glance at a forum post. One more click on a Webbering banner before I surrendered to the offline world, and then I would click the disconnect button. The modem would fall silent, the screen would dim, and I would sit there in the stillness, feeling both relieved and a little empty. Relieved because the internet, for all its magic, was a fragile place. It was slow, clunky, unpredictable. You never knew if the next page would load or crash. The music would stop or loop endlessly. It took effort, it took patience. And when it worked, it was beautiful. But it didn't always work. And when it failed, it could be maddening. But there was sadness too. Because even in its chaos, the early internet felt like home. It was personal, human, quirky in a way that modern platforms rarely allow. You weren't just scrolling through content made by strangers for clicks. You were stepping into living rooms, into dreams, into awkward poems and messy GIFs, and hand-coded declarations of love for boy bands and video games. Each page, each message, felt like a connection, and disconnecting meant saying goodbye. Not forever, but enough to feel it. I would go downstairs, the hum of the computer still echoing in my ears, and try to rejoin the rhythm of the real world. Sometimes dinner was waiting, sometimes it was quiet, just the ticking of a clock and the distant sound of a TV. I would sit there, thinking about the conversations I had online, the pages I visited, the people I met but didn't really know, wondering if they were logging off too, wondering if they felt the same strange pull between worlds. Over time, that feeling changed. The internet became more present, more persistent. You no longer logged off, you just moved to another tab, stayed signed in, so the magic didn't leave. Exactly, but it lost some of its shape, its boundaries. The digital and physical coexist so closely it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. But back then it was different. Back then every session felt like a little gift. Every login was a ticket to somewhere new. And every logout was a reminder that magic, even in its purest form, has limits. I don't think we understood how special it was at the time. We were just kids with clunky monitors and too much imagination. We weren't trying to change the world. We were just trying to make a place for ourselves in it. And somehow, with blinking cursors and dial-up connections, we did. Now, when I think back on those days, I don't miss the slow speeds or the constant crashes, but I do miss the simplicity. The sincerity. It's a sense that the internet belonged to everyone and no one, that it was ours to explore, to shape, to leave our mark on, even if only for a moment. And maybe in some quiet corner of the web, my old Geocities page is still there, a little frozen snapshot of who I was, of what we all were, imperfect, curious, hopeful, and always, at the end of the night, logging off with a mix of relief and sadness.